following Ambassador Oren. But you remember that, as a historian, I'm sure you know this story, that when Abraham Lincoln met Harriet Beecher Stowe, who wrote Uncle Tom's Cabin, he said, "Oh, you're the little lady who started this big war." So you're the big man who started this little war over your book. And the first thing I wanted to ask you was whether you're surprised at the furor and the controversy and the polemics that have surrounded your book. And if you're not familiar with them, I brought several choice clippings so that you could look over them.
Behind here.
Exactly.
There's a box.
Did it surprise you?
First of all, shalom. Thank you, David. Thank you. Thank you for that reception. You don't know, I get very sentimental, so I warn you, cry warning. This is the last event of a 2.5-week cross-the-nation tour. I'm very impressed that you can actually give me a standing ovation, because I could give you an ovation, but I'm not sure I could stand at this point. So thank you. I would respond, David, by quoting another Lincoln story. Lincoln used to tell the story of going into a small Illinois town and seeing a man who had been tarred and feathered and ridden out of town on a rail. That's what they used to do. And Lincoln is watching this horrible exhibition, and he notices that the man is smiling. And Lincoln tells the story. He goes up to the man. He says, "Wait a minute, you're being tarred and feathered. You're being ridden out of town on a rail. Why are you smiling?" And the man says, "Well, if it weren't for the honor of it all, I'd rather walk." So I've had a little tarring, a little feathering, but most of it has, in fact, been very superficial. Most of the tarring and feathering has not been about the book, but been about me. It's been rather personal, and I'm not going to go into the whole little litany of things I've been called in the last 2 and 3 weeks. But they're pretty choice and pretty juicy. But the honor of it was that almost nobody was taking this book on its merits. No one was challenging the content of the work. So bring it on. Call me whatever you want to call me. But read the book. And let's have the discussion that the book was designed to initiate, to inaugurate. And this book was supposed to come out in October. October, November is the time when publishers bring out their serious works of nonfiction. All right? This is the month where you do beach reading. You know this? Those of us of a certain age remember Jaws. That was like the ultimate summer reading book. You wouldn't go in the water. I pressured Random House, my poor publishers, to bring this book out now in late June, precisely because we are at a fateful juncture in the negotiations for a possible, what we would call a very bad deal on the Iranian nuclear program. So it came out now on purpose. I told Random House, you know, I know it's beach reading. We'll call the book Jews, all right? People will be afraid to go in the water. There'll be like a yarmulke going through. But can I say this in the Nixon Library? That's what it was designed to do. It was designed to have precisely this reaction. So I was gratified with that.
I'm going to actually discuss the substantive part of the book in just a moment, not right away. I want to ask you one personal question, which is, there is, and you talk about this a little bit in the book, there is a great contrast between being a historian and being an ambassador. For that matter, being a citizen and being an ambassador. And being an ambassador entails all sorts of restraint and care, and there are things you can't say. Now, I've never been a diplomat, although I've been a clergy, so it requires a certain amount.
Always speak your mind.
Right, exactly. A certain amount of diplomacy, especially with the parents of children in our school.
Right.
But no, your child's wonderful, really wonderful. But I wonder, when you wrote the book, how did you approach it? I mean, did you internally say, okay, I'm no longer a diplomat, I'm a historian, or I'm a loyal citizen of Israel? I mean, what was your self-conception as you sat down to write it?
It was actually, at times, an agonizing process. First of all, to decide to write the book, I had to go through a process of sort of detoxing from being an ambassador. When I first came back to Israel, this is in the beginning of 2014, and I went on television, I had no idea who I was. Am I still ambassador? Can I say things? Can I say something critical of the administration? Can I say something critical of the Prime Minister of Israel? And actually, there was an Israeli anchor woman, Ayala Hassan, who was terrific. And we went for a commercial break. She turned to me and slapped me in the face. And she said, "Stop it. Stop being an ambassador. Get out of that character." And every time I see her now, I go over and beg her back, "Because of you, she got me out of it." It was a terrific moment. The book was harder still, because not only was I making a transition from being an historian ambassador to a private citizen writing a memoir, I had never before written in the first person. I'd never written a sentence that began with I. It was always about, Richard Nixon did this, Golda Meir did this. And that was a transition. What's my voice? Who am I in the book? And then you come up against the really hard question. What do you write about and what do you don't? As an historian, I always say the historian's job is the job of decision maker. For every 100 facts, 1 goes in a book. 99 you leave out. So you have to make a decision all the time. In this, the decisions are, what is discreet to disclose? Are you betraying a confidence? Are you hurting anybody you don't want to hurt? I'm very sensitive to this. And then what are my duties as someone who was privy to classified information? Now, you sometimes sign agreements that say you cannot disclose things, but very often it's left to discretion. I had a good sense of the red lines. This book was vetted by 7 Israeli agencies. Twice by the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, twice by the Defense Ministry, the Justice Ministry, the Foreign Ministry, and the Mossad. The book is about 5 pages long. These are just photographs here. There's nothing really in it. This was, by the way, an extraordinary process. I'd never gone through it before. I actually thank the vetters in the acknowledgments. I don't know if it was ever done because I was so impressed with the way they worked and the arguments. And you could actually get into an argument with them. They'd say, you can't have this. This is why you need this. And sometimes I won, sometimes I didn't win. They actually took out very little. So the whole process of deciding how to write this book in itself could be something of a book, David.
The difference between Israeli society and American society, which is probably very hard to capture in a sentence, seems to me couldn't be captured better than by our imagining George Stephanopoulos slapping the ambassador of the United States on a Sunday morning talk show when they go to commercial. But doesn't that say something, actually, that story about the intimacy of Israeli society that is very different from the way America works?
So I go back to your first question. I set myself among the outline. I set myself an outline. Okay, who am I going to be? Am I going to be too prescient, too self-aggrandizing, by contrast, too self-deprecating? You had to get it just right. But one of the items I listed was called nuggets. What were the nuggets? I wanted to expound on the differences between American society and Israeli society, and particularly between Israeli political culture and American political culture. For example, America is a Roman-style republic. Israel is an Athenian-style democracy, which means we all yell at each other and scream at each other and throw chairs. Lots of civility. My distinguished colleague from across the aisle. We don't have that in Israel. It's like knucklehead. Bimbo. Very different. I learned, my father was a career officer in the U.S. military. I talk about him a lot. He landed on Normandy, fought through World War II. He's 90 years old. I'm seeing him for the July 4th tomorrow. But he taught me as a kid that Americans salute the rank and not the person. That's very important to internalize. I looked at some of the reactions of conservative, even Fox commentators, to the decision of Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu to speak before both houses of Congress in March. They supported the Prime Minister. They weren't big fans of the President, but you don't disrespect the office of the presidency. Israel, we don't salute anybody. In the United States, the former president is still Mr. President. In Israel, the former president is Ehud. Maybe. We don't have that. And there was one observation which I flag quite often, is that Americans are nice until they're not. And it can happen very quickly, and that always throws Israelis off, because they don't quite know where they are, whether Americans are in their nice mood or not nice mood. And I sort of boil it down to the photographs of President Obama and Vice President Biden. And if you go into any embassy, probably any post office, you have a picture of the president, the vice president, and look at their expressions. They are smiling. They got big teeth, smiling. Look at the picture in an Israeli post office. Right, you got it. You got the president, at the time was Shimon Peres, the prime minister, Benjamin Netanyahu. They are looking at the camera and scowling. Scowling. And you think about, okay, what are the difference? And I consider that American leaders can afford to smile. And we live in a very, very tough neighborhood that if you even show a bit of that, a little twinkling in your eye, it could prove to be dangerous, and your enemies could derive the wrong conclusions. So you juxtapose these pictures of the president and the prime minister, the president and the vice president, and you see it all. You see the nugget.
Also, we're the world's leader in dental care. I don't know if that.
Americans have very white teeth.
You did make, though, an observation that sort of complicates this about the use of profanity. I wonder if you would share that with the.
Yeah, well, Howard, we're in the White House mock-up here. There's some spicy language in this book, and that was a decision also I had to say not to use asterisks and things like this, but they actually used the language because Washington political culture is heavy on expletives, just is. And every other word basically is a four-letter word, and everybody uses it. And I don't know what it is. It's like a default word, or it's made to sound tough, but that's the way people talk. Can I say this in front of you guys? I mean, I don't know. Yeah? So I quote my first conversation with Rahm Emanuel, which was typically at 2 o'clock in the morning. And he calls him up, and I grab for the phone and get Rahm in my ear, and Rahm opens up with, "I don't like this fucking shit." And I say, "Rahm, I don't like this fucking shit either." What are you supposed to make of that? Now, the interesting thing is that Israelis don't curse. We have some curse words. They're almost all Arabic and Russian. We don't know what they are. They're used wrongly. We really don't even know what they mean. Because here's the Bible. God does not curse. God condemns, but he doesn't use curse words. And so Hebrew doesn't bequeath us that vocabulary. We don't have it. I couldn't translate. So when the White House used a certain epithet to describe Netanyahu, chicken shit, last spring, I had to go on Israeli television for 12 hours and try to find the Hebrew equivalent of chicken shit. Because Israelis aren't going to get this. Chicken? I don't get it. What does it mean? And you can say pachdan, but it's not pachdan. It's not, pachdan is a coward. But it's you're missing something. So we just don't have it, and it was a nugget. It was a nugget the way Americans speak in American political culture and the way the Israelis speak.
So so let's move to the substantive
This is substantive.
Issues, right? Exactly. Language is culture. Yeah. That's right. Iran. You chose the release of the book because obviously this is a crucial time, and I was just talking about the fact that we had a meeting yesterday, and I don't think it's not a secret because he's been public about it, with Congressman Ted Lieu, who said that he is inclined to oppose any agreement that doesn't meet all the conditions basically that Israel has asked for, and it doesn't look like this one will. So even the Democrats, yes, you may applaud, that's okay with me. I'm not going to object to any. But I think we're in for a huge fight in America. It looks that way. And I wonder what your take is on, because so much of the book is a characterization of the different ways that the administration sees Israel and that the Israeli administration sees Israel's predicament. So can you just talk about Iran and what you expect and what you fear?
Oh, thank you, David. I just I've actually spent several meetings in the last 2 days here with your congressman, with Ed Royce, who does just an astounding job. A great friend. Thank you. I had the privilege, I stress the privilege, of representing Israel with a team in nearly 5 years of intimate discussions with the United States, with the administration on the Iranian nuclear program. And this were experts, it was scientists, security people, all classified. Here's what I can tell you. We looked at the same data, and we derived pretty much the same conclusions. Where Iran was in its program, number of centrifuges, number of facilities, how long it would take them to break out if they decided to break out and to create nuclear weapons. We understood that. Where were the gaps? The biggest gap, and this is going to sound it's going to sound silly. The biggest gap is a structural gap. The United States, you may notice, is a big country. You are far away from the Middle East. You are not threatened with national annihilation by the Iranians, and the United States has the largest military capabilities of any country on earth. Israel is a small country. We are located in Iran's backyard. We are threatened with genocide by the Iranian regime. They said they're going to wipe us off the map. We've got to take it seriously. And the IDF, the Israel Defense Forces, is a very formidable army. We're roughly twice as big as the French and British army combined. But I don't want to shock anybody. We do not have aircraft carriers. We do not have strategic bombers. Which means that our margin for error on Iran is exactly zero. Exactly zero. We can't even make a fraction of a mistake. So let's start with that. Then in addition to the structural differences, there were the ideological and conceptual differences. And I can boil it down this way. As a researcher, as a writer, it's very easy to write about the President of the United States because he's very vocal and he expresses his mind. So he has said that the Iranian regime is rational. He says it many times. He says they're anti-Semitic, but they're rational. This is a recent interview with our common friend Jeff Goldberg. They're rational. They operate, the regime operates on a cost-benefit analysis. If properly engaged, it can be a productive regional power. It can actually work to reconcile Sunni and Shiite Muslims. I'm just quoting, folks. And this went to the heart of the debate in this intimate dialogue. And that if sanction relief, if the sanctions were lifted, the Iranian regime would use this money for productive purposes. The Israeli position was no, that this is an irrational regime, and that irrational regimes, like the Nazis, can sometimes take rational steps to reach insane goals, conquering Poland and Czechoslovakia. Rational goal, that sometimes you have a regime like the Nazis that even on the last day of the war, while Germany is being conquered, they're taking precious military resources and using it to kill Jews. That's an irrational regime. This is an irrational regime that was a jihadist government, which is the world's largest sponsor of terror. It is conducting or trying to conduct terror across 5 continents, now 35 cities, trying to kill Jews, Israelis, and Americans, by the way, trying to blow up my embassy in downtown Washington, D.C., trying to blow up a big Cafe Milano in Washington, D.C., and assassinate the Saudi ambassador, but kill everybody else in the restaurant as well. This is not a sane regime. And this is not a regime that's going to take $100 billion in sanction relief and use it to build roads. It's going to take $100 billion in sanction relief and use it to upgrade Hezbollah and other terrorist groups that are going to try to kill us. So it came down to that type of distinction. So there, I just basically said the whole debate in something over 2 minutes. But that's it.
Well, I'm not adding, because I'm sure given more time you would say exactly this, but I write a weekly column for Time, and on this I talked about the fact that the vast majority of Iranians are not actually all that enamored of their regime, and every regime that wants to exercise any kind of effective tyranny, they know they have to keep the military fat and happy. So the first block of money is going to go to the Revolutionary Guards, and then to all the proxies, and only then, after that, to whatever infrastructure needs to keep them in power. But there has never been, over the past 30 years, there's never been any backing off from their declared intent to wipe you off the map. So it's not as though this is a new agenda. It's a very old agenda.
Indeed. And you know, they had a dry run on the Arab Spring in June 2009. Right. They had the Green Revolution. And they learned, they're very smart, never underestimate the intelligence of Iranians, ayatollahs. Ehud Barak, the defense minister, used to say they don't play checkers, they play chess, and they don't play one-tiered chess, they play triple-tiered chess. So they had a dry run, and they learned how to cope with a popular revolution. And they created basically a 1 million-man army with a thug corps known as the Basij. And today, if you go on in Iran, even if you don't like the regime, you go on a little website that says something critical of the supreme leaders, there's going to be a knock on your door in about 2 minutes. And you're going to disappear for a very long time. You may never come back again. They have this down. And that you have not seen a peep of popular opposition since June 2009. They got it down.
What's your prediction about what's going to happen and the reaction in Congress?
I feel like I should have a pool about this. I don't want to sound, again, though I spent most of my life in Jerusalem, I don't want to sound too prophetic. And it's like this. If I always try to put myself in the other guy's seat, and the other guy, in this case, is an Iranian negotiator. Now, since 2009, the position of the administration has been that the window for diplomacy will not remain open indefinitely. But guess what? It's not a window. It's an aperture. It never closes. And the Iranians have been led to learn that the longer they negotiate, the more concessions they're going to get. So I ask myself now, at this juncture, what is Iran's interest in signing this agreement, say, as early as Sunday? I was pretty sure they weren't going to sign on June 30th, and again, I sound prophetic, but it's not. It's just seeing the world through their eyes. They have already gained immensely just from the negotiations. Remember when the negotiations started 6 years ago, the United States said Iran has no right to enrich, Iran has no right to have nuclear facilities, no right to have centrifuges. Iran is a terror-sponsoring state. What is the American position today? Iran has a right to enrich. Iran gets to keep its facilities. Some of them may be transformed in some ways, but they get to keep, nothing's being dismantled. They get to keep all their centrifuges. Nothing is being dismantled. And Iran has moved from being part of the problem to being part of the solution. And there's a tremendous amount of legitimacy it's gained for achieving its hegemonical aspirations in the Middle East, which is to be the Middle East primary power. So you haven't heard for a long time anybody in Washington say, Assad must go. Remember that one? It's not here anymore. Not much criticism of Iranian involvement in Iraq, Iranian involvement in Yemen. Think about it. So they've already gained immensely by not signing. So I have to ask myself, as an Iranian negotiator, what am I going to get if I sign next week? What I'd get would be sanction relief. That's the concrete goal here. But then I have to ask myself, wait a minute, if I hold out a little longer, maybe the sanctions will unravel anyway. And maybe I won't have to give up anything. And so I'm uncertain whether this week the Iranians will sign. Maybe they'll agree some kind of broad framework agreement, not an actual hard and fast treaty. The president said, I guess 2 days ago, that he's ready to walk away from the table. Now, I'm sorry, if that's true, that is a very important position. I'm not going to, if that's true, he has to stick by that. Now that he said that, he has to be able to walk away. Last point, I'm drawing on. I wrote you hear all this criticism I get for being politically incorrect in this book, but a couple of, I guess 2 months ago, I wrote a Time piece, right. Time magazine piece called How Not to Buy a Middle Eastern Carpet. And I was called an Orientalist, I was called a cultural stereotyper. Notice I didn't say Persian carpet, I said Middle Eastern carpet. And I drew on my own experience as someone who's gone carpet shopping quite often around the area. The first law of carpet buying is you never answer the carpet merchant's question, how much are you interested in spending? Because then that becomes the base. So if the Iranians are saying to the United States, say in 2010, how many centrifuges do you think we should have? All right, and America says, I don't know, 200. That gets up to 6,000 real quick. Yep. Second thing you never do is you always have to be able to walk away. Always have to walk away. If the carpet merchant comes after you, you've got a deal. If he doesn't come after you, you don't got a deal. In the Iranian nuclear arrangements, the Iranians walked away and everyone went running after them. The customers went running after the merchants saying, please, I want to buy your carpet. And that's been the case up to now. And so if the president now is saying, I'm the carpet buyer, I'm going to walk away, and he means it, that'll be an important message.
I want to know structurally, do you think the fact that the leadership of Iran sees itself basically as leaders in perpetuity, whereas American leadership changes every 4 to 8 years, means also that American leadership just structurally is always more anxious to get a deal because that's your legacy.
It's legacy.
Whereas if you know you're going to be there in 20 years, or at least you plan to be there in 20 years, you don't have to worry about whether you get it today.
Indeed, and there's some of the people who maybe even think in terms of immortality there.
Right.
And yes, and I understand legacy. You know, the Republicans won the Senate in the last midterms, and I went on Israeli television. There were a number of Israelis said, well, that's that. No more problems from Washington. Now the Republicans control both houses. And my response was, not so fast. A president who is stymied on his domestic agenda at the end of his second term is going to be looking to build his legacy on foreign affairs issues. One was going to be Iran, the other is going to be Palestinian issues. And coming to a theater near you, near us in this case, they'll be focusing for legacy issues.
Okay, so I want to take a brief pause for a commercial announcement. I'm only going to be able to discuss 2 more issues before I open it up to everyone, but this is an incredibly rich book, and it discusses infinitely more than we will be able to talk about tonight, and among other things are many interesting portraits of people that you all know, that you see on television, that you see in politics, and one of the reasons to read this book, you should excuse me for the gossip value of it, in addition to the analysis of the kind that you're hearing tonight. So I just wanted to be able to say that before I return to 2 more questions, one about the president and one about the American Jewish community, which are both topics that I think ought to be at least discussed. Do you think, for example, the fact that the president had what was characterized as a very good week domestically will make him less over-anxious about his foreign policy legacy? Because now he's got same-sex marriage, Obamacare. He has a fairly solid record of domestic achievements by the views of the administration.
That is a really interesting insight, David. I hadn't considered that, because I'm actually thinking the opposite. There was he had a similar good week a long time ago, back in, I think it was in 2011. Good week where things went for him on the Hill. The administration also gave itself very high grades for handling the Arab Spring, and I talk about how I cabled the prime minister, and I said the president is to use a colloquial expression, is feeling his oats, and I think that he'll come back now to the Palestinian issue with renewed vigor, which would be to the same argument but flipping it on its head. I think it's an interesting comment you just made. I'll have to think about it. I actually do think occasionally. But I think the natural reaction would be, my gut feeling would say, he's on a roll. And that he will use this momentum, and he did have an extraordinary week this week. He would use this momentum to get onto to ride it to a next, for his legacy issue. And by the way, again, quoting the White House, the Iranian nuclear deal is the most significant foreign policy achievement which this administration hopes to achieve in its second term in office. So it's here with all this momentum behind it.
More than the pivot to Asia?
More than the pivot to Asia, alas.
So the portrait of the president is obviously a major and a debated topic in the book. I wonder if you would characterize for us why you think the president sees Israel the way he does, and how he sees Israel and why he sees Israel the way he does.
Well, this was the chief question that occupied me when I first came into office, again going back to 2009. The ambassador's duty is to understand the customer, in this case, the customer being the President of the United States, a man who was not very well known in 2009. He hadn't been in politics that long. He ran a brilliant campaign, but how well did people actually know him? And I had to get, just like I want to see the world through the eyes of an Iranian negotiator, I had to see the world through Barack Obama's eyes, and how to get there. So I used I gave myself a self-taught course called Obama 101, and I used all my historian's skills by sitting down, doing my homework, reading everything he had said, interviewed, statements, and anything related to the Middle East and Israel. But two of the most important, but really the most important source of all, was his own memoir, was Dreams from My Father, which I read again and again in almost like Talmudic scrutiny, looking through it, because he wasn't thinking of running for president back then. It was kind of a window into his soul. And then combining that with everything I had learned over the years of teaching at various universities in the United States. And understanding that in this administration, by the way, which had a highest percentage of professors of any administration since Kennedy, it was the most centralized administration since Roosevelt, and more decisions were actually made in the Oval Office. You put this together and you begin to piece together a worldview. And the worldview has several components which are very important for Israel. First of all, America is not the world's policeman anymore. You may have heard this occasionally. America is going to work in a collegial fashion with other powers, particularly with international institutions such as the UN, which are not always so friendly to the state of Israel. Israel was much more comfortable with America being the world's policeman. A recoiling from a use of military force. A reaction to the Iraq and Afghanistan war was something really deeper. It harkened back to even the 60s on campus. The president had a very illuminating remark at a conference in 2010 in which he said, and I quote, whether we like it or not, America is the world's leading military superpower. Now, think about that line for a second. Would you imagine John Kennedy saying that, or Bill Clinton saying that, or Ronald Reagan saying that, whether we like it or not? In Israel, we wake up in the morning and say a little bracha, a little blessing, that the world's leading superpower happens to be the United States of America, because it wasn't always the case. So that is an important part of the worldview. Reach out to what Obama called the Muslim world, which in itself is a concept. It's a concept taken from Islam, which had challenges for Israel, but also opportunities. If the president is engaging with Muslims around the world and saying Israel is legitimate, that's great. But there was unprecedented support for the Palestinian cause, unprecedented opposition to Israel's settlement policies, and right from the outset, President recognized Iran's right to have peaceful nuclear energy, and he made it his case to reach out and reconcile with Iran. Now, these are all issues that impacted us at a very fundamental level, and I had to report it, I had to understand it and internalize, and I set as my goal never to be surprised. I got surprised, one time in particular, September 2013, over the Syrian Red Line on the chemical weapons, where I actually thought there would be some rockets, American Tomahawk rockets into Damascus, and it didn't happen. And that was a big threshold event for Israel, by the way. It was perceived completely different in Israel than the way it was perceived here. But that was, I don't know, they used to say this when I grew up, getting inside someone's head. And that was very important for me.
So, how do I ask this neutrally?
Don't. Go ahead.
Don't.
Rip.
So why is it, in your view, given that your portrait of the president is unsympathetic to the way you think a president should treat Israel? I think that's the best way to put it. I don't want to say it's unsympathetic to the president. I don't want to say that you think he doesn't like Israel, but it's unsympathetic to the way that you think he should act towards Israel. Why is it that most American Jews still support the president and voted for him twice?
Well, let me just, it's very interesting.
I don't know what
because you like their decision, or you like the question, or you're just interested in the answer?
Okay, good. If you're applauding the question, we're good.
I don't get the applause. First of all,
that actually is not a plausible explanation, because I know most American Jews, or a number of them, and one thing they're not is stupid. They may not agree with your reasoning.
Certainly not.
But believe me, they're very articulate in their ability to defend their own reasoning. You may think they're ridiculously wrong, but that's different from being stupid.
No.
So I'm going to let him decide.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you. I didn't even hear her. Right. First, I just want to correct one impression.
Sure.
I think when I say that the president doesn't treat Israel in the way that I think is befitting an American president, befitting an ally, there's a reason why I called it this. And that theme recurs quite frequently. How should an ally treat another ally? It doesn't mean we have to agree on everything. It's the way we disagree is really the litmus of an alliance. That is not, he is not categorically, uniformly, monochromatically in the wrong. First of all, Israel makes mistakes, but also there were times when we needed the president and he was there for us. And I have that, I think, a moving passage about how we turned to him during the Carmel fire disaster, when all of northern Israel was going up on flames and we had no more retardant to put out the fire and we had no more extinguishing planes. And I was sent by the Prime Minister to speak in this room, by the way. I had to cross this room. Were you there that night, Hanukkah party? December 2010.
No, I wasn't.
No, I was outside. I was coming into the Hanukkah party, which is always very strange for Jews, because the White House is already decorated with Christmas decorations. So you have a lot of rabbis, a lot of Orthodox Jews nibbling latkes under the mistletoe. It's very surreal.
Kissing one another, no doubt.
Kissing one another. Nagia. And I was outside the White House, and I got a call from Benjamin Netanyahu, the prime minister, using a voice that you do not want to hear the prime minister use, panic, saying, this fire has just killed 26 people. It's heading toward Haifa. We have no means of stopping it. Go and meet the president. And I go in, meet the president, and he immediately turns to his aide, Reggie Love, and says, give Israel whatever it needs. And I spent the entire night in the NSC in the West Wing. Of the 11 extinguishing planes in America's arsenal, we got 8. The U.S. military scrubbed down warehouses throughout Europe to get us the retardant we need. We got these hotshot commandos who parachute behind fires, put them out. They left Idaho and made it to Israel the next day. I mean, this was the alliance. So we had deep policy disagreements. And many of these policy agreements were made publicly, and I think that was a huge mistake. I can go into detail about that. No surprises, no daylight. But that doesn't mean that that he is unexceptionally problematic for Israel. I want to make that case. Why American Jews? 78% in 2008, 70% in 2012 voted for Barack Obama. So I tell a story here where I grew up in New Jersey, and you're supposed to applaud at this point. Thank you. Those of you from New Jersey, right? Right? I spend more time defending the state of New Jersey than defending the state of Israel. I want you to know that. I once said that to Senator Menendez, and he didn't laugh. I'm the only person in my family to move to Israel, to make Aliyah. I grew up and I thought I was inestimably lucky to be living at a time in Jewish history when there was a sovereign, strong Jewish state, and I would be damned if I was going to spend my life in New Jersey and miss it. So I went off to Israel, but my entire family, quite big, including many people in this area, stayed here. And every single member of my family, a very educated and smart family, voted Democratic in both elections. I don't know a single person who voted Republican. And it's not as if they don't care about Israel, they care passionately about Israel. Some of them even like me. They certainly like my wife and kids, and they love my grandkids. And I asked them, and we had this before. The single answer, most frequent answer I got was the composition of the Supreme Court. And you find it as social issues, caring about the poor, caring about the indigent, caring about single-family mothers, caring about immigrants. These are Jewish liberal issues. And that's what you're seeing in the vote. It's, even for people in 2008, members of my family were sleeping in Obama pajamas. But much of that romance has died off. What's left are the core values, are the core liberal Jewish values. And I think if he were to run again tomorrow, he'd still win a significant majority of American Jewish votes. Mm-hmm.
No. I don't disagree with that. I mean, I told you, we discussed this a little bit before. I think I have a complementary spin. I don't even want to say a different spin. A different spin is, I think, I mean, when I was asked by Mosaic and earlier by Commentary magazine to write why I thought Jews don't vote Republican, and I said the principal reason, as I understood it, was with the single exception of Jack Kemp, I don't remember a Republican candidate who made a passionate case that they care for the poor. Many made the case that the government doesn't help the poor, but they didn't make the case, and therefore we need to do this, 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 and this to help people who are disadvantaged. And until I think most Jews feel that sense of compassion from a candidate, they feel estranged from them, but you enlarged it to other social issues as well. And I think that that may be good, that may be bad, but I'm being descriptive now. So it's not a question of not understanding the consequences. It's a question of different emphases from the emphasis that I think you and I would guess many people in this room would choose. And now we will find out, because we're going to have a chance for you to ask questions as well. I would just ask you to keep them shorter than mine.
Thank you, gentlemen. Our first question is to your left.
Ambassador Oren, you made an appearance some years ago at UC Irvine, which became somewhat of a tipping point.
If memory serves. We're going to do a reenactment, or what are we going to do?
No. No. But that was a tipping point in certain approaches to handling an issue that you've paid a lot of attention to during your ambassadorship. You've spent a lot of time with our Jewish college students and others on our college campuses. And I'm wondering today, as we look at the confrontation on the BDS situation, which is more troublesome to you, the actual conflict of BDS on campus or a lack of understanding and connection to the state of Israel and the Jewish people of many of our young children and young adults that are coming to our college campuses?
It's a great question, a very thoughtful question. Well, obviously, the latter facilitates the former. If you are already disconnected from your Jewish identity, if you're detached from Jewish history and Jewish faith, then you're a much easier target for BDS. And BDS knows this. I don't want to get into inside baseball on Israel. I'm sort of the BDS in Knesset now, the BDS man. I had a committee on it. I had it's like a caucus. You can't call it a caucus in Hebrew because the word for caucus is the same word for coconut. But it's called a lobby, but we had a hearing 2 weeks ago, and we are educating Israelis about BDS. The BDS made a mistake. They came after us on the two most sensitive issues for Israelis, soccer and cell phones. So now every Israeli knows what BDS is, but they didn't. When I came back from Washington, nobody, including high-ranking security people, had no idea what BDS was. So beginning to understand it, I think it's important that we dedicate the proper resources to fighting BDS, to understand that it is a potentially strategic threat to the state of Israel. It's not aimed at getting a better two-state solution. It's aimed at taking us down, as getting us isolated, and crumbling our economy, creating a situation where Israelis can't travel in the world, where we can't defend ourselves. We'll have great planes, great tanks, but the tanks won't be able to rubble, and the planes won't be able to take off because we won't have the right to defend ourselves. And that means investment. At the end of the day, I'm in government. Believe me, it's about allocations. It's about appropriations. And right now, Israel is spending less on defeating BDS, defending itself BDS, than the Norwegians spend on public diplomacy. Now, you know, Norway has terrible problems with those fjords and the locks and the stuff. It's terrible, but they spend more than we do in defending their image abroad. It's amazing. So we have to switch the dial and start, first of all, allocating money. It's hard, training the proper personnel, and to understand that BDS, make it difficult on BDS. I think it also has a policy situation. We have to be very proactive on the peace process because BDS disguises itself to kids on campus. They said, we're really in favor of peace. We're really in favor of a two-state solution. We're just against settlements. I can show you websites like this. Yeah. Kids sign up because they don't like settlements. They want a two-state solution. They don't know they're working for an organization that's striving for Israel's destruction. We got to make it difficult for them all the time. We have to educate ourselves. We have to allocate the right resources, we have to train the right personnel, and we have to be proactive on the diplomatic front to take away the initiative from the people who want to delegitimize us.
For those of you who don't know, BDS is boycott, divestment, sanctions. It's an attempt to not invest, to prevent corporations, universities, so on, from investing in Israel and divesting from them.
We have a question in the back row.
Okay.
How much of this administration's interest in negotiating with Iran is related to trying to garner support from Iran against ISIS, in the fight against ISIS?
It would seem logical right now. There's a sort of a confluence of interest between the United States and Iran in combating ISIS. So what was the excuse then for the years when there was no ISIS? And David Axelrod, really one of the closest advisors to the president, just came out this week and acknowledged what I had noticed back in 2009, that from the very first day in office, the president had set his sights on reconciling with Iran. And that was clear to us. And there was no ISIS back then. So right now there's there's an alliance of convenience. I think it's very, very misguided. I don't think, again, I want to reiterate, this regime is not a rational regime. It is not a regime that's going to dedicate every sanction relief to roads and hospitals and schools. And ultimately, this is going to blow back on America. And that's a very difficult case for a foreigner. I'm a foreigner to come in and make that. But keep in mind, Iran and its terrorist groups have killed more Americans than any other terrorist organization outside of Al-Qaeda. And that's not including the hundreds and perhaps even thousands of American servicemen who were killed by Iran during the Iraq War. Let's not forget who we're dealing with here, folks. These aren't friends. These aren't even frenemies. They aren't.
We have a question to your right.
I would like to know your impression about the contract of between Israel, it's a construction contract between Israel and China. And China said that they didn't want workers. So it was understood as they just want the Chinese workers to go over there. Wouldn't that be unfair to the Israeli workers and to the economy of Israel as well?
Well, that's an interesting question. Did you get that? Well, it's funny because are you very well versed in Israeli politics?
Pardon me?
It's an issue we deal with. This is the inside Israeli ball. You asked me about importing Chinese laborers into Israel and whether that's unfair to the Israeli workforce.
Exactly, because
okay, it's a great question. I don't know how it's
contract.
interesting, but this is I'm in Knesset. I'm in a centrist party. I'm in a party that's very concerned with social and economic issues, but we also have to contend with a simply egregious housing crisis. We're short 150,000 units right now, and that number is going up by 45,000 units every year. The world doesn't want us building in the West Bank, and not only is the country the size of New Jersey, but 62% of it is desert. And a small room apartment, you can get a very big house in Orange County for the size of a 3-room apartment in Israel. So young people can't afford housing. We have to bring down very quickly the price of housing. And it's very difficult to do that unless we import foreign labor. So my party on one hand, cares very deeply about the Israeli worker. On the other hand, we also care about young couples and families who don't have a place to live. So this is real politics. This is where you have to make compromises. All right? There was a great Glenn Campbell song. There's been a lot of compromising on the road to my horizon. Here it is. So what we're saying now in our party is that we will bring foreign laborers, particularly Chinese laborers, in on a one-time emergency basis. We will build the 150,000 units, and then we will transfer their jobs to Israeli laborers. So thank you for that question.
We have a question in the third row.
Ambassador, thank you for such a wonderful memoir. When Prime Minister Netanyahu came to the UN and drew the red line, many analysts feel Iran has already passed the red line, and no action has been taken by Prime Minister Netanyahu. Do you believe Iran has passed the red line, and why hasn't there been any action taken? And if it hasn't, under what circumstances would Prime Minister Netanyahu actually confront and take military action?
Okay, the latter question I can't answer in public, and I frankly don't know the answer. I think that answer is lodged somewhere in the Prime Minister's consciousness. But what I can say is about the red line, because I was present when that red line was drawn, and it's drawn at a certain level of enrichment of 20%, of a certain amount of tonnage of 186 kilograms. And if it was going to go up to 20% at 250 kilograms, that was crossing a red line. This is all getting very technical. One of the problems with the Iranian nuclear problem in general, it's not given to sound bites. You can't describe it in 7 seconds, and it is very technical. Iran has never gone beyond that red line. To the best of my knowledge, never gone by that red line. But it has done is spread out horizontally beneath the red line. So now we have a situation where, according to the best reports about what's on the table in Europe, with the Iranians, they're talking about a 10-year period of very intrusive of inspections, and the Iranians cannot go beyond that red line for those 10 years. But during the 10 years, they will be building this way. They won't be building this way, they're building this way. More facilities, more research and development, more advanced centrifuges. So on the day after the 10th year, they can break out. And they can break out not in a year, they can break out in a month, maybe less, and they will break out not to 1 nuclear weapon, but they'll break out to 200 nuclear weapons in one day. It's called sunset to arsenal. Remember that term, sunset to arsenal. And 10 years, think about what you were doing 10 years ago. Wasn't that long ago, especially when you get to be my age. And it could happen very well. It's one of the great things that deeply disturbs us about this agreement.
What do you think would happen? What do you see as the day after, not if Iran gets a nuclear arsenal, but if we bomb? If we bomb Iran, what happens next?
Okay. One of the big issues, and here we're getting into somewhat sensitive territory, but let's see how indiscreet I can be. Since we're
nobody, is anybody here going to talk?
This is off the record, okay?
Friends, all right. Friends.
Our biggest, one of the major considerations in Let me rephrase this. Israel, irrespective of what anybody else does, and the Prime Minister has said this now repeatedly in public, if Israel has to stand alone, Israel will stand alone. It's not the last time. And in Knesset, we agree on absolutely nothing. Again, we scream and yell at each other, we throw chairs at one another. It is almost unheard of to have a national consensus on anything. There is a national consensus on Israel that this is a bad deal. And there's a national consensus around the fact that we have the right, the duty, and the capability to defend ourselves against Iran. Understand it. It's not a matter, But the question of the day after is a major question. Remember I said I quoted Ehud Barak before saying that the Iranians play multi-tiered chess. One of those tiers is Lebanon, where the Iranians have moved 100,000 rockets aimed at our homes, aimed at our neighborhoods. That is more rockets than are in the possession of NATO, aimed at a country the size of New Jersey, and now the Iranians are assiduously attempting to upgrade those rockets from rockets that simply go up in the air and come down, like last summer's rockets from Gaza, to rockets that can be directed and guided with a joystick. And we do not yet have sufficient defense against this. So it's a joint U.S. Israel program called David's Sling, which can intercept a guided missile. But it's very sophisticated and very expensive. And they know this. Not only do they know this, but they have dug these rockets underground into more than 200 villages. They put the rockets in homes with real families in them because they want us to kill the families. So we'll be condemned in the world, we'll be denounced as war criminals, we'll be denied the right to defend ourselves. Keep in mind, we have now had 4 wars against terrorists in Lebanon and in Gaza. We know that we cannot eliminate these missiles from the air. We've got to send in our army. The enemy's going to have to fight from village to village, house to house. Many, many people are going to get killed on both sides, particularly on the Lebanese side. And this is going to take not weeks, but months. So we need not only Iron Dome in a military sense, we need diplomatic Iron Dome. We need resupply. So these are considerations that Israel has to make. And they're part of, it may say very good, oh, Israel has to, exercise its right to defend itself against Iran. It's true. But it is an immensely complicated and dangerous situation for us. Understand that.
We have a question in the front row.
Ambassador Oren, I enjoy seeing you on the Sunday morning news programs. You're an extremely eloquent speaker on behalf of Israel. And you astutely said that you do have to put yourself in somebody else's shoes. After 8 years of a disastrous George W. Bush administration where the world saw our invasion and occupation of Iraq as an attack on the Muslim Arab world, didn't Barack Obama have to reset our relations with the Arab world vis-a-vis Cairo? He's just trying to, there's 1/5 of the world's population is Muslim.
I got you. Listen, it's a legitimate question. All questions are legitimate, or almost all. I mean, in a way, you're preaching the choir. In 2003, I was invited to testify in front of Congress on the Iraq War. And it was an interesting experience because I appeared with my professor, with Bernard Lewis from Princeton. He was in favor of the war. I was against the war. For all sorts of historical reasons. My advice was, don't get involved in state-making in the Middle East. The British tried and failed. The French tried and failed. States like Iraq are held together with brutal, savage power. Americans don't have it. I don't care what anybody says about you in the world. You are not a savage people. And the war went ahead. But to his credit, I will say this about George Bush. He always made the case. He always stressed that America is not at war with Islam. And I was there when he made these pronouncements. He said it again and again. And it's true, this term violent extremism entered the American political vocabulary at the end of the Bush era, not at the beginning of the Obama era. So I thought that while there was a benefit that Obama, who certainly back then in 2009, 2010, saw himself as a natural bridge between the West and what he called the Muslim world, and I use that word very in italics because it's actually an Islamic term. It assumes that there is a Muslim world that you could address and accommodate, and I'm not certain there is. And I thought, as I said earlier, there were possible opportunities in Israel in that. I also thought it was unfair to the previous administration to even suggest that under the Bush, America thought of itself as war with Islam, because it wasn't true. And Bush deserved more credit than that. I never heard him say that. I never heard him say that. If you can quote me one time where he said that, I'll whatever. I'll eat my hat. I don't have one. I'll eat his hat. It's leather. But it just wasn't, and I thought it was unfair to impute to the president that approach. He was very, very careful. Having said that, I think that I spent a long time discussing the Cairo speech of President Obama, 2009, which was a totally revolutionary document. It is a foundational document. For me, it was something like it was a core text. Whenever I had a question about America's foreign policy in the Middle East, I'd go back to the Cairo document. It's twice as long as the first inaugural address, by the way. And in that speech is, I'm a personal bridge. There's a thing called the Muslim world. America has been at war with Islam. We're no longer is going to be at war with Islam. I can quote it again. America is not and will never be at war with Islam. What do you understand for that sentence? That America was at war with Islam. And it is a fascinating text, but a very, how should I say this diplomatically, a very challenging text.
We have a question in the back row.
Yes, I'm curious about considering how our foreign policy does tend to wax and wane with different administrations. We're discussing some differences right now about how one administration approaches things differently than another. Is there any unified principle that Americans might try and promote, whether Republican, Democrat, or otherwise, that would help us to maintain more stable relationships with other nations?
Yes. Categorically, yes.
Would you care to tell us what it is?
Know who your allies are. Know who your allies are and cherish them. Do not squander them. Respect them. You don't have to agree with them all the time. But don't be cavalier about alliances, because they're rare in the world. True alliances. Israel has no alternative to the United States as its ultimate ally. There's no other country that's going to give us $4 billion a year in aid, even though 75% of it is spent here. But there's no other country in the world. There's no other country that's going to stand by us in international organizations. There's no organization that's going to, no country that's going to resupply us during wartime. America. And by the way, the American population, irrespective of what's going on in relations between the prime minister and president, the popularity for Israel in this country keeps on going up, not down. Even last summer it went up. It's amazing. It's an alliance between peoples. And the United States, conversely, and this is not to establish a symmetry. America's a superpower, Israel's a tiny power, but America has no alternative to Israel. We are the only democracy in the Middle East. We're the only country. We're more than that. By the number of democracies are getting smaller every year, not more. We're one of the few countries in the world that has never known a second of non-democratic governance. We're up with New Zealand, Australia, Canada, the United States. And we're the only member of that elite club that has never known a second of peace, and we're still democratic. We have the army that I talked about, twice as big as the French and British Army combined. We are strategically located at the nexus of 3 continents. We are technologically and scientifically robust, and we are unreservedly, passionately pro-American. We are the only country, not the Middle East, we're never going to see an American flag burnt on the streets of Tel Aviv, ever, ever. What that means? We are the only country, I don't know, in the Middle East and beyond, where, should it ever come to this, God forbid, where 100,000 American soldiers have to land with all their equipment in 12 hours. Not only would they be received, they will be regaled and celebrated. How many other countries in the world like that? And there's no alternative. That's my advice. It's not a plug for the book. Ally. It is a plug for the book.
Thank you, gentlemen. Please give both a round of applause.
Can I? John, last point. Thank you all so much. You don't know what this means to me at the night. Before I jump on a plane back to Israel, I take all of your warmth back with me. Thank you to the Nixon Library. Thank you for my host. Thank you for feeding me, friends. And a special friend to, as they say in Orange County, Mori Rabbi, Rabbi David Wolpe. Thank you so much. You honored me tonight.
Ambassador Oren will be in the lobby to sign your books. Good evening. God bless.